I really appreciate that enthusiasm. Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. If you're just joining us, this is week 2 of 10 questions, and the question this evening is, what is knowledge? Before we get started, there's a couple of acknowledgments I'd like to make, and I'd like to ask for audience's help in doing that. Students, where are you? I'm coming out into this space over here, just so you know, upstairs. Right here. If you would kindly, this is a thank you, and if you would kindly use the microphone.
Anne-Marie Burke and her extraordinary UCLA Arts Communications team, Kylie Kerrigan and Louis Kale, who have nurtured and brought this project to fruition.
Yeah, perfect. And for my next thank you, I need another class volunteer right here. Thank you very much.
Also to Dean Brett Steele and the School of the Arts and Architecture, who have offered tremendous support for this course and initiative.
Thank you. This is a good way of distributing responsibility. Angel, will you do me one?
No.
Okay. How about Eugenia? Okay, this, and this is a thank you to
The Department of World Arts and Cultures, Dance, who are hosting us and whose considerable planning and technical expertise make 10 questions possible.
Thank you. And lastly, a big thank you to Andres.
Andres Cuervo and the UCLA Centennial Celebration Committee for their support of the 10 questions class and for making this course and public conversations a marquee centennial event.
Thank you, Jimmy. Okay. Now you know the thank you comes from all of us. I also want to say that as a land-grant institution, we recognize the Gabrielino Tongva people as the original caretakers of this land, and we are grateful to be visitors in this place. So, we often consider research in the university to be focused around the pursuit of what we call new knowledge. And this might mean new discoveries in science, as well as new ways of understanding not only who we are and our complex histories, and which are quite divergent, but also our present moment. At the same time, I'm going to put this down. At the same time, what is considered to be knowledge, who holds the knowledge, and what happens to it is part of a continued effort on the part of all of us to make a more equitable, accessible, and fair society. So who owns it, who has it, who moves it, and who receives it is part of an ongoing process. In preparation for this evening, students brainstormed the question, what is knowledge? And here are some of their responses, and students, you may recognize your own. Knowledge is what you can know definitively. Knowledge is one's own unique understanding of the world. Another student quoted Shakespeare, "Ignorance is the curse of God. Knowledge is the wing wherewith we fly to heaven." Another, "Being educated is not the same thing as having knowledge. Knowledge is constantly evolving." Many students said this, but I like this one in particular. "Knowledge is power," and then in parentheses, cheesy but true. "Knowledge is questioning your environment and evaluating your experiences. Knowledge is our best way of talking about life and passing down experiences. Knowledge is knowing that you don't know everything. It's openness, vulnerability, a willingness to learn and hear different perspectives, and a challenge to be the best person you can be. Knowledge is being aware of something and its origin. It is not enough to know a fact or opinion, but one must also know the source of it. Access to knowledge is something that should never be taken for granted because it has been denied to so many for so long and still is. Knowledge isn't found in answers, but in questions too. So speaking of questions, tonight we're privileged to hear from a philosopher, a playwright, and an evolutionary biologist who will consider with us the different ways that they consider knowledge. And before I ask these three guests to join us on stage, I'd like to share a little bit about each of them with you. Their bios are also in your program, so if I'm a little bit brief, I hope you'll supplement it with what you've read. So Tyler Burge is a distinguished professor of philosophy at UCLA, where he has taught since 1971. He has taught and lectured in institutions including Oxford, Columbia, Stanford, MIT, and Harvard. He has made contributions to many areas of philosophy. His enormous body of work includes articles and books on philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, epistemology, philosophy of language and logic, and history of philosophy. 14 conferences in 15 cities in the US, Europe, Australia, and Asia have been entirely dedicated to his research. Sylvan Oswald, who our students just spent the last hour with, is a writer and artist working at the intersection of theater and live art. An assistant professor of playwriting at the School of Theater, Film, and Television, his language-driven plays, texts, publications, and videos unravel narrative forms to explore how we construct our individual and national identities. Sylvan's honors include a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship, a Rosati Fellowship from Duke University Libraries, the Tom Thomas Award from the Dramatists Guild, a Jerome Fellowship, and residencies at Sundance, UCross, McDowell, Colony, and Yaddo. And, woohoo. And then Shane Campbell-Staton is an evolutionary biologist and assistant professor at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. He studies how climate shapes demographic history and adaptation over prehistoric and contemporary time periods, and how complex phenotypes respond to anthropogenic climate change. He has published numerous articles, hosts the popular podcast Biology of Superheroes, and teaches a course of the same name to teach his students the biology of aging, genetics, evolution, genetic engineering, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, the ethics of reviving extinct species, parallel universes, intelligent alien life, and how biology shapes modern society. Please join me in welcoming our three guests. So we agreed in advance that Tyler would start us off, and be followed by Shane, and then followed up by Sylvan. And so we're just going to jump right into it with you. Okay, here we go.
Am I on? Good, okay. I was going to start with just providing a kind of framework for thinking about knowledge. Large issues, large concepts. There are two main types of knowledge: knowing how and knowing that. Knowing how is a kind of skill, and the knowing how comes at quite a number of different levels of intellection. So, for example, knowing how to tie your shoes or knowing how to balance on a bicycle are basically motor skills. But knowing how to set up a laboratory or knowing how to use the library or knowing how to listen to other people in ways that will make them comfortable enough that they provide you with knowledge, or knowing how to be sensitive to other people's vulnerabilities. These types of knowing how are quite sophisticated in many ways. They're trainable, and they're a part of what university provides. This is often forgotten when universities are advertised as providing knowledge. They do. The second type of knowledge that, but knowing how to do things, in particular knowing how to learn after you're finished with your education, to continue to learn, that's an important skill that is and should be provided by the university. The second main type of knowledge is knowing that. This is, in effect, roughly knowing facts. Over the last 2 millennia, the history of philosophy has focused quite a lot on knowing that, or various analogs of knowing that. There's a widely, almost accepted explication of knowing that. It involves 4 factors. It's true, justified, or warranted, or supported belief, where the warrant or the support tracks the truth in the individual case. So 4 factors: truth, belief, support, certain types of support, and the support tracking the truth, not being irrelevant to what makes the belief true. All of these factors are quite complicated, and understanding them well is a serious matter. So if you're interested in pursuing these matters, take a course in epistemology. These matters have been worked over and discussed for centuries, and it's not stagnant stuff. In the last 100 years, philosophy does move slowly. In the last 100 years, some of these 4 factors have been understood much better than they were before. We understand the notion of truth much better because of work in semantics in the last 120 years. We understand the notion of belief better through developments in psychology, and perception, which has become a topic of a very serious science now. Types of justification or support have been vastly better understood in the last 100 years, partly because perception, which is the base of much of our knowledge, has come to be understood much better in the case of perception, much better understood in the last 40 to 50 years. Okay, I'm not going to go on about these 4 factors. I just list them and invite you to think about them more. Each one is rich, complex, and raises lots of interesting questions. I think it's very important to be a pluralist about knowledge. There are various types of knowledge. Don't get focused on one type too much to the exclusion of others. They differ largely in the ways they're supported. All of them are supported. In all cases, the support tracks the truth. In all cases, they involve belief or judgment. And in all cases, they're true, but they differ in the types of support that they involve. So I want to just call to mind various types of knowledge and allude to various types of support that they have. There's a large body of common sense knowledge, which ranges from things like, well, you know that you have 2 hands, or you know that there's motion in front of you within 100 yards, right? You know that quite certainly. You know various things that are more complicated about other human beings. We learn this not just by going to the university, but by living life. There's a rather sophisticated, common sense psychology that we apply to one another and that is often exhibited in the greater novels. But it's also used in everyday life. So there's a range of common sense knowledge ranging from simple perceptual knowledge or simple memory to complex thinking about other human beings, in particular their psychologies and how they interact with us. The two most impressive types of knowledge that are conveyed in the university are knowledge in science and knowledge in mathematics. These are more impressive than most other types of knowledge because they're systematic. In the case of much of science, it's also mathematized, so the two types come together in much of natural science. In natural science, the system is held together by a kind of glue. The glue is explanation. The point of science, I think, is to understand, and the tool for gaining understanding is explaining things. The type of support that empirical science is based on is observation, usually through experiments. Experiments need to be repeated and checked, communicated, made open to others so that they can be further checked. And then there's inference from the observations to theories or models which try to explain what has been observed in a systematic way. These theories or models themselves are open to check through further experimentation. Okay, that's just basically the scientific method. Science has been an extremely impressive enterprise. It started really with Aristotle, but got going in the 16th century with Galileo and Kepler. Later Newton, of course. Mathematics is different. It provides a different sort of knowledge, but definitely knowledge. It's not based on observation. It's not based on repeatable laboratory experiments. It's based on understanding basic principles and on proof. Okay, so like empirical science, mathematics is systematic. Not through explaining observations, but by relating different mathematical results via proofs. A further type of knowledge is knowledge of history. History is different from the other two in that the experiments are not, there are no laboratories, there are no experiments. It is based on observation, but the observation is mostly not repeatable. We have evidence that comes from past events. There's a totality of evidence. We can keep finding more and more, of course, but probably it's ultimately a finite amount. And history tries to produce a coherent account of the past. It does produce knowledge. We know very well that Napoleon lost most of his army through invading Russia in the early 19th century. We know Hitler lost most of his army and largely lost the war because he invaded Russia in the mid-20th century. Those are pieces of knowledge, simple pieces. More interesting pieces provide coherent narratives that connect different individual pieces together. Another type of knowledge, often underrated, I think, is moral knowledge. It's often said or thought that morality is just a matter of sort of your allegiance to certain things you want to be so, and that morality varies with different people and different cultures and so on. I believe there's such a thing as moral knowledge. I think we know very well that it is morally wrong to torture children for the fun of it, just to take an easy case. It doesn't matter that some people actually do that. That doesn't make it right. They may even believe it's right, That doesn't make it right. Same thing about slavery. Aristotle actually believed slavery was okay, morally defensible. Almost nobody thinking clearly would agree with him about that. We've acquired moral knowledge in the last 2 millennia. Aristotle made the mistake because he underrated the notion of human rights, and he underrated the humanity of the slaves. He tended to talk about them as lesser beings. Quite amazing. Aristotle, one of the wisest, greatest philosophers, making this simple mistake. But I think it was a mistake. We can give historical reasons why he made the mistake. We can think maybe back then it was easier to make that mistake than it is now. It's still a mistake. What about art? Art doesn't set out to convey knowledge primarily, but it does present objects of art that can lead to knowledge. Reading Shakespeare, for example, seriously, will lead you with a greater knowledge of human nature and human behavior. But art is not just about conveying knowledge that. I think it plays a big part of what it does is to convey knowledge how. It expands our imaginations, enables us to think of new possibilities, and by looking at the world from different perspectives. Okay, I want to just say 1 or 2 things about common mistakes about knowledge. Some of these mistakes are even conveyed within the university, and I think it's deplorable that they are, but so be it. One type of mistake is to think that knowledge must be certain. Very little knowledge is certain. Certainty resides primarily in simple mathematics and in logic. Even our finest scientific theories, say in physics, are not absolutely certain. It's possible that some new evidence will come in that will make us realize that what we thought is true isn't. Okay, so I think looking for certainty is a mistake. We should be confident. We should have strong support. But certainty is a factor in mathematics and logic and in almost no other parts of knowledge. Another thing is another mistake is the idea that knowledge needs proof. Again, proof has its home in logic. So if you say, I know such, and somebody says back to you, well, prove it, you should respond, or you could respond by giving some evidence or something, but the evidence isn't a proof. Strictly, your response should be, well, this is not a type of knowledge that is supported through proof. Neither of these mistakes are particularly pernicious, I think, but another mistake is, it's the idea that there's no really, it's often said, absolute knowledge. There's only relative, strongly held opinion in different cultures. Often it's said, everyone has their own reality. I think the motive for this type of talk is good-hearted. It's meant to make people tolerant. It is important to be tolerant of other people's perspectives and opinions, but one shouldn't push the metaphor to the point that everybody knows a different reality. If that were so, you would be just talking past one another when you're learning about the world. Another way in which this idea is applied, I think misapplied, is in, let's take a case of a person, a minority, who grew up in a tough neighborhood. It's common to say that person's reality is different from ours. I think that's not correct. I think reality is a single matter. We all face reality. It's just an extremely complicated, layered reality. Nobody can possibly understand all of reality. And all of us have different perspectives on reality. So instead of thinking, well, they have his own reality and we have ours, which I think separates people, it's better to encourage tolerance by having a certain humility about the huge complexity of reality. Other people have different angles on reality. The person who grows up in a gang-infested neighborhood understands about things about the world that other people don't, because that person has observed other things and experienced other things that other people haven't. So I think a proper tolerance should be based on the idea reality is so complicated and layered that we should be eager to listen to other people, to gain their experiences and their perspectives on reality, because people have different perspectives. Two other points against relativism, and I'll stop. One is, I think it's a mistake to infer from the fact that there's disagreement to the conclusion that there's no knowledge in some area. Sometimes one side of the disagreement knows what they're talking about, and the other side doesn't. Sometimes it's just a very complicated matter, and there needs to be disagreement to arrive at knowledge. There's disagreement in science on natures of details. Science is still pursuing knowledge and often acquires it. Okay, that's one mistake. Don't infer directly from disagreement to lack of knowledge. This is especially pernicious in talking about morality. People disagree about moral matters. Sometimes it's because deciding what is the right thing to do in a given circumstance is extremely hard and complicated, and so it's like disagreement in science. To get anywhere, you need to have some back and forth. But the fact that there's disagreement in science doesn't entail that there's no knowledge. And similarly with morality, I think. One other point, which I think is quite a serious one and worth real reflection, science itself changes and evolves. So Aristotle thought that species came in eternal packages, never changed. Since Darwin, we know that none of the species that are around now were there at the beginning of life. Species are constantly changing, right? Similarly with Newtonian mechanics, tremendously powerful theory. Got a lot of things right. One of the greatest achievements in science. Still, it's been found to be not quite true. So 200 years ago, it was regarded as a paradigm of knowledge. Now we know that it's not quite true, that relativistic mechanics and quantum mechanics are correct. But then we can apply the same reasoning to our own science, of course. What happened to Newton, of course, could happen to us. Our best scientific theories might turn out later not to be right. Does this show there's no such thing as knowledge? No, it doesn't. It shows in science that science is aiming at an ideal that maybe in some places it'll actually realize, and in some places maybe it won't. But Newton's theory is not just simply false. It's approximately true. Even Aristotle's theory of species has got things right about it. Many species are relatively stable for relatively long periods of time. Some of them change very fast. Some of them stay relatively stable before they change. Well, Aristotle did observe something important about the world. So I would say he got something approximately right, and Darwin developed things much further and got refined matter. Same with the relationship between Einstein and Newton. Einstein built on Newton. So we can see Newton's theory is approximately right, but not fully right. So often we have approximate knowledge aiming at better knowledge. So a certain humility about our own views is an important attitude in trying to gain knowledge. It's humility before this extremely complicated, layered reality that we're up against. We should expect some things that we think, even confidently now, to be knowledge, or just approximate knowledge. I think I'll stop with that. Much else to discuss, but that'll be a beginning.
To get us started. That was extraordinary. Shane, over to you.
All right. So this idea of what is knowledge, I'm really excited to be able to participate in this, because as a scientist, I typically don't get to think directly about the sort of epistemology around the things that drive my everyday life. I'm sort of in the weeds with the statistics. But when I'm thinking about this, question, there's a few things that come to mind, and I wanted to bring up three general ideas about what knowledge is to me, using examples from my own research. Right, so I think first of all, knowledge is the sort of incremental building on a foundation that's already there. I think a lot of times when we think about true knowledge, it's like something completely novel, but that thing I think honestly just doesn't exist. And I think especially as we move through time, like as we move forward as a culture, right, the incremental knowledge that we gain is going to be smaller and smaller. Now every once in a while you might have another big jump, but I think those jumps become harder, right, the more we know. So I wanted to give an example from my own work as an evolutionary biologist. So, if we travel around the world, we encounter, a set of ecosystems that vary in a lot of different properties: temperature, humidity, day length, seasonality, et cetera, et cetera. And in each of these environments, we can observe a group of organisms whose, form, function, allow them to survive and reproduce, in the face of the distinct challenges that each of these environments presents to them. And like one major question is, how have these animals become so suited to fit the environments in which they now live? And where did they come from? Right, from a biological perspective, and this is evolution, right? This idea of trying to understand the relatedness of organisms, and then the changes that happen along these different branching patterns that we call speciation or lineage divergence. And this theory, as was just stated, was in large part due to Charles Darwin. My man Chuck is, he's an OG. He's the guy who started like this modern field of evolution. But he didn't get it all right. One of the things, he was a man of his time. One of the things that Darwin believed is that this process of evolution is something slow, right, and gradual, something that plays out over thousands or millions of years. Like we can never actually see evolution take place. We can only sort of see what it leaves behind, like a footprint in the sand. But over the last couple of decades, we realized that that's actually not the case. We can observe evolution happen in real time. And this is what my work revolves around. So if we take this understanding of our traditional view of evolution, and then we apply it into this modern context, we can ask a different set of questions about the relationship between organismal performance and function and the environment, particularly the environment as we change it. Right? So how do organisms adapt and evolve in the face of things like urbanization, pollution, global warming, extreme weather events, et cetera? And this is what my research program is based around. And this is a really important question nowadays because the things that we do have effects on the tree of life all over the planet. Right? So if we look at the major killers of threatened species, overexploitation, agricultural activity, urban development, pollution, et cetera, we can break this down further. Right? These are all the things that we do, right? Domestic waste, dams, fires, logging, hunting, we do all this stuff. right? And it's stuff that has, real life impacts and effects on, non-human species around the planet. My lab focuses on contemporary evolution. So when we're thinking about building on incremental knowledge, I just want to use a quick example from my work here up in this corner on elephants. Right, so conflict, right? Human conflict, war. This has been a major force throughout human history, obviously. One of the things that we're starting to understand is that not only does war impact civilizations that fight those wars, and those that may be innocent bystanders, but it also affects the wildlife that occupy the spaces in which those wars are fought as well. And we can see this, as it plays out across the continent of Africa. And I want to focus on one particular country, Mozambique, which has had, its fair share of conflict. And this has particularly to do with, its effects on the elephant population. So in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, there used to be a really large population of elephants, about 2,500 animals, which is pretty significant for that square, kilometers of that park. And before the war, we know that there was a certain level of natural tusklessness amongst elephants. So in African elephants, there's typically a very small proportion of females specifically that lack their tusks. They never grow them. And this typically floats around at between like 2 and 5% in a population under normal circumstances. In Mozambique, before the Mozambican Civil War, it was actually quite a bit higher, about 18.5%. And then during the Mozambican Civil War, it's like a 15-year conflict, there was a drastic decline in the population numbers. It went from about 2,500 to about 250. But there was also a noticeable increase in the relative proportion of elephants that lacked those tusks, moving from 18.5% to a bit over 50%. Now, even in the next generation born after this war, right, this generation never actually saw the Mozambican Civil War. They still has a significant increase in the proportion of tusklessness in that generation. So this suggests that there's human-mediated selection, right, and then also across generations an evolutionary response to that selection. And that selection in this case is hunting for the ivory trade, which fueled a lot of the arms purchasing during that conflict. So I spent the last couple of summers in Mozambique, in Gorongosa, trying to understand exactly what is going on with these elephants, specifically what is the genetic basis of this tusk loss in elephants, and can we see actual signatures of selection in this species genome in response to this really rapid contemporary conflict. So here, I should say before I got into this, I never worked on elephants before. I spent most of my time working on lizards, so that was kind of weird. But I teamed up with this group of biologists, to collect a lot of data about these animals. You just saw a helicopter crew go in, they dart this animal with a tranquilizer, and then a road crew comes in, helicopter drops off the air crew, and everybody comes in and starts collecting data. And basically this is a race against the clock, because this is a gargantuan animal and it's got a bunch of gargantuan family that's really pissed that we're doing this. So we want to get her up and on her feet, and we want to get clear as quickly as possible. So when we're thinking about evolution as it plays out in this context, right? I mean, this generates knowledge, or at least I hope it generates knowledge, but that knowledge is an incremental step, beyond the original theory of evolution, just played out in a slightly different context. The second thing I wanted to point out was is this second idea of knowledge as data that yields predictable outcomes, right? So this resolution of an if-then statement. I have a bit of information, right? And I think that information is due to some concept. If what I have is actually due to that concept, then I should be able to make predictions about information that I don't actually have, right? And it's that predictive nature that I think it lays a foundation for knowledge, at least as it plays out in the sciences. So I want to use an example from this genetic basis of tusk loss. Now I should say that this is like we're talking about knowledge. This is brand new knowledge. These data are probably like 72 hours old. So you guys are like some of the first to see it. So if you put it on Instagram, I'm gonna come find you. Trying to get this published. So when we're talking about the genetic basis of tusk loss, we were in sort of searching the genomes, of the animals in this population for genes that were responsible for this tusk loss. We came across one gene that was of particular interest. And this gene is called OFD1. And it's of particular interest because, again, as I said, this trait in elephants seems to be female specific. Well, this gene, OFD1, in humans, is also a marker for a disease known as oral-facial digital syndrome, which is marked by a bunch of craniofacial abnormalities, including lateral incisor agenesis. So these individuals don't grow their lateral incisors. Well, tusks in elephants are actual lateral incisors. So there's an interesting connection there. What's even more interesting is that the syndrome in humans, it's what we call it's X dominant. So the gene lies on the X chromosome, and it's dominant, meaning that the phenotype that it codes for is expressed over an alternative version that exists on the opposite X chromosome, and it's male lethal. So in humans, affected males, they miscarry somewhere between the first and second trimester. So now we have this bit of information, So we have, our information that we've pulled from these genomes. We have the information about those genes pulled from the literature, other people's knowledge. And now we can make some explicit predictions, If this tusk loss in elephants is actually X-linked, dominant, and male lethal, we should be able to make specific predictions about the patterns that we see in this population. So we'll step through this together. So when we're talking about X-linked dominance, So if we start here with A, then we know that the non-disease state, in this case, having tusks, is recessive, So in order to express tusks, you have to have 2 copies of the recessive allele. And males, again, if this is male lethal, all males, because they only have 1 X chromosome, that should also have the recessive version of this gene. Which means that in this pairing, if we're looking at males by squares, and females, that every tusked female, when we look at her daughters, they should all also be tusked. And the same is true for males. So we actually went out and did some calving surveys, looking at the distribution of phenotypes and sexes amongst the calves being born in Gorongosa. And we see that here, if we look at maternal phenotypes, those individuals with 2 tusks, they only have daughters with 2 tusks. So we have some predictive power there. The other thing that we should see is that in the disease state, that females should always be heterozygous, because they're always getting an X chromosome from their father, which should always be the recessive state, So they should always have 1 copy of the disease state, 1 copy of the recessive state, which means that half of an affected female's daughters should also be affected, but half should be unaffected. And half of her sons should be unaffected, half should be affected, but those affected males are never born. And because those affected males are never born, what we should see is a skew in the sex ratios of offspring being born to tuskless females. And when we go out into Gorongosa, that's exactly what we see. Not only do we see it, but we see it in the expected proportions, So you expect there to be a skew of like 66 to 33, 66% females to 33% males. And our empirical data show that it's like 65.7%, it's close. And it's a significant deviation from that 1-to-1 ratio. So again, that's the predictive nature of knowledge. The last thing I want to sort of zip through really quickly is this third idea of knowledge, which I think is best illustrated by what we call thought experiments. So I think that in science, we're a special kind of people, because I think we get a little bit full of ourselves sometimes, right? And we get caught up in the quantitative nature of what we do, but quantitative knowledge and abstract knowledge, I actually think, are false dichotomies in a lot of ways. And we see that as it plays out in the sciences. For instance, with the dawn of quantum physics came a lot of complex methodology, a lot of complex equations, like trying to understand the nature of the quantum world. And amongst those theories was the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum superposition, which basically explains the relativistic nature of quantum matter. What does that mean? Exactly. And then along came my man Erwin Schrödinger, and he was like, okay, yes, relativistic, so on and so forth. But what if we look at this as a cat, right? And that cat's in a box. And that in that box is some poison, and that poison is going to break open at some random time. You don't know when. You had the cat in the poison box, close the box, and then you wait. Right? At some point in time, you can think of the cat as both alive and dead because you're not sure what's going on in that closed system until you open it, observe reality, and then the probabilistic nature of this system collapses into a single reality. All right. Now, here's the thing. That's a zombie cat, and that doesn't exist, right? This is all abstract, right? There's nothing quantitative in the concept, right? But it allows us to understand quantitative data. Yeah, and so as a science communicator, I really like this idea of the thought experiment, and I've pushed this, really hard, particularly, when it comes to superheroes, comic books, and science fiction. So in my podcast and in the course I teach here at the university, we look at biology through the lens of comic books and science fiction. So just to give you a few ideas, right? So Batman and Bane, right? So we use Batman and Bane to understand, the genetics and plasticity of elite athleticism. Like, what is it that makes an athlete, right? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it both? And what information do we have, right? All steeped within our understanding of who this character is. And then also, Bane as a character, how he goes about, extending that information, extending that performance through the use of, what is essentially a super steroid. Right. We can take Spider-Man, my man Peter Parker, brilliant scientist, brilliant young kid, but ultimately when we look at him, he's a bioengineer, right? A bio-inspired engineer. He got bit by the spider, got all these superpowers, and he could have stopped there. He's like, I'm super fast, I'm super strong, I'm good to go. But he decided to go back into the lab and use his namesake, the spider, to come up with this web formula of his. And there are plenty of people all over the world, plenty of scientists that are using the materials that are made in the natural world, including spider silk, to engineer all sorts of materials for all sorts of different purposes. All right, we can look at Cyborg, my man Victor Stone, as the pinnacle of the interaction of man and machine, right? This fusing of the biological and the technological, right? And this sends us down a thought experiment thinking about, well, where are we now in terms of prosthetics? How can machinery actually communicate with the human body? What is the shared language there? And what barriers do we have to get over in order to get what we see in the pages of that comic book? We can think about the Flash of Two Worlds, right? This, Barry Allen in one universe and, Barry Allen and, anybody remember the other? Jay Garrick? In another universe. So this reminds me, especially in evolution, of this idea of that was posed by Stephen Jay Gould, right? If you replay the tape of life, do you get the same result? over and over again. Now, again, this is not something we can actually do. We don't have a time machine, I'm sorry to say. But there are all sorts of experiments that we can do as evolutionary biologists to get at this question, the roles of fate and chance in shaping the world we live in. So I'm actually going to stop there and wrap it up with those three ways of knowledge that were just on the screen really quickly. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Thank you so much, Jane. We will continue.
Okay.
Sylvan.
All right. I'm just going to mix it up and use this old thing. So I just want to say thanks again to the students who were with me earlier today. Thanks for being willing to go to some of those places and try some stuff out. You know, I'm really different from these guys. I don't have facts. I don't have theories. I have myself. So I guess all I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my career with you, and then I'm going to maybe read a little bit for you, just to give you a sense of the kind of work I do. So I'm kind of off the cuff tonight. I'm a playwright, but I also make other kinds of work. I sometimes make performance texts, which I can distinguish for you what the difference between those things is. And sometimes I make videos, and sometimes I make books. And it all sort of depends on what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to say, who I'm trying to work with. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a totally other kind of knowledge. It's the more subjective kind of, you know, how do you know who you are? How do you know what you care about, what matters to you, what matters to other people? How do you know how to be a good person? How do you know what to be careful of? You know, there's this playwright, Marcia Norman, who talks about the primal nature of theater and storytelling. And she talks about, you know, the cavemen people, right? And how every night after a long day of hunting, gathering, and maybe whatever else they get up to, you know, that they're going to sit around the campfire and, you know, after the kids are go to bed, and talk about how the day went, right? Oh, did you see that tiger over there? Oh gosh, you know, don't get bit by that tiger. You know, or like, oh hey, I found a new source of berries, but there's a water buffalo. I'm making stuff up, but right. So it's like life lessons, things to be, you know, to ways to. That we share stories about what happens to us so that other people don't make the same mistakes, right? And you can imagine that sort of this act of storytelling, or really maybe just event reporting, starts to become really important in human civilization, because now we are acquiring knowledge of like where the dangers are, like where the lions live and whatnot, and when they like to go out hunting for human flesh, I don't know. But so you get this sense that there's this like primal part of us that is built to retain that information and to learn from that, from things other people tell us, or stories that other people convey to us about something they went through, right? That sticks somewhere inside us, just on a basic level. And I get annoyed by the word storytelling because I'm, you know, I don't start from story. I'm kind of a weirdo in that regard. Like, some people are like, what's the story you have to tell? And that is not at all how I think. I find story to be actually really difficult. Story is not my favorite part of writing, which is probably surprising for some of you who don't, maybe if you don't know a lot of writers, you might be like, what is this person talking about? But I really am excited about language, and I'm really excited about aesthetics, and I get really excited about the discovery process that happens for me when I make my work. So I might start out, so it's like, I'm curious actually later as we go on to hear like how you all would map the sort of types of knowledge and discovery processes that we've talked about just now or heard about just now onto what I'm about to tell you and how that works. I'd really be interested to see what parallels you can discover. But for me, it is a discovery process as I'm writing a play in that I don't know where I'm going. I might not know why I'm even doing this, other than it's time to write another play so I can have a career. But often it's coming from some emotional place that I can't yet name or that I don't understand. I've had circumstances where I wrote something when I was younger and I didn't understand it till I was older. And I was like, oh, that's pretty good, you know? But like somehow I have to hold on. It's weird because you're like, you know, we live in this world where we're like, I've got to know, or like, I want to clarify. And especially in my industry, people are like, I don't understand why he's dressed like that. If, you know, like they're really trying to make it all add up in a tidy package. And if you're really going after something deep and strange and new, you're just not going to always be able to explain yourself. Actually, I loved what Professor Burge was saying about sometimes there is no proof or you don't need proof for that kind of thing. I'm totally going to use that. But because there's another kind of proof or knowing that can happen, and it just arrives differently and it feels different and it lands in your body and it's part of the thing that we make together when we make a performance. So I'll give you a couple examples from some of my work of how I have no clue. And that's actually a really generative space for me. Because a lot of times I'm starting with a question or I'm starting with some kind of curiosity, sometimes about a form of content, like a question, like, what was it like to live in a house that is sinking? This is a play I wrote about the neighborhood where my mother grew up, which is the neighborhood called Logan in Philadelphia. And it was built on unstable landfill in the 20s or something. And then it was sold by a bunch of guys who knew that it was crap land. And eventually, naturally, all of the houses start sinking. And it looks like a crazy place. Like the sidewalks are doing this kind of thing, and the roofs are, it's like a twin or like a duplex, and like one's like this and the other's like this. They're not, it should be like this. And my mom grew up, and she grew up in a household that was violent and abusive. And so for me, when I hear these stories, growing up with this mythology and history, for me, the sinking house becomes a metaphor for the messed up family, right? What it must have felt like to try to grow into a person while you're being, gravely oppressed, in the core of your being. And so to try to find a way to express that, to share that knowledge and understanding, that emotional reality with strangers, how do I do that? Right? We talked earlier with the students about how a playwright or artist sort of like builds a structure to convey that information. It's a little like a Trojan horse situation where you have to build this, exterior to deliver the special surprise, we're attacking you, via Trojan horse. Like, look, I've got you a present, But that's how we make plays, is that by being really careful and thoughtful and intentional about how we build the container, like, is it a comedy, is it a tragedy, is it a melodrama, is it a mashup of multiple things, what other techniques am I using? I'm gonna grab that water before I get too far into this. Thank you. And, do we know when to deliver a laugh or when to, because you can't just start out being like, this is sad. You can't like start at the beginning. Even if we know that's where we're going, if we start there, it's sometimes called playing the ending. Like, that's a critique a director might give to an actor. Like, okay, well, we know you're going to be sad later. You can't be sad now. We have to have somewhere to go. There has to be some kind of a progression. So, okay, now back to the other examples. So, I wrote a play when I was 20. So I was in college, and I had just started learning the, theater theory. Every field has theory, and so do we. And I was learning some really exciting stuff. And I started writing this play called Goat Songs, which is based on the root of the word tragedy, which literally comes from like goat and song, which had something to do with these ancient tragedies were performed at festivals in honor of Dionysus, whose spirit animal is a goat. And so if you won the competition, you'd get a goat, which you probably had to immediately sacrifice. But that's for Dionysus. So, and I was really interested in the idea of sacrifice and something I had seen happen to someone in my family. So I guess I work a lot from family history stuff because I'm blessed with a really huge, messed up family. So I'm constantly sort of drawing from those things, really to try to understand, like, what the hell? How did you people act like that? Or how did this person end up with this bizarre personality? What happened to you? I mean, we think this all the time about our friends, about strangers, about people in power. What happens? God. And so I really wanted to, I had something happen to a cousin of mine, and I was really trying to understand how a parent could do that to a child. Basically, the kid was really disturbed, and he had just gotten into this high school for performing arts, and I was so happy for him. And then the mother picked up the family and moved to Florida. And I was like, that was his chance. Like, that was his chance. And I ended up writing this play that actually didn't tell that story directly. It told like a story about a kid who lost something. And that part is just the background to say that when I wrote the main character, whose name happens to be Fergus Marvels, it's a fun little name, and I just was like, I don't know, that name is weird, I kind of love it. He sounds like a real character, almost cartoony, but not. And I wrote the character, so sometimes if you've ever seen a character list for plays, it's like, so-and-so, male, 30s, likes to party, I don't know. But so this one was Fergus, a boy to be played by a girl. And I've talked all of this way to just get to this. I think maybe I was avoiding it. But the thing is that my collaborators would be like, why is this boy played by a girl? And I would be like, I just don't know. But just try it for me. And they would do it, and bless their hearts, they totally went for it. And I did not know what I meant by that, but I knew that it was something queer. Like, I knew that was something I wanted to see on stage because I hadn't seen it on stage. And by the way, up to that point, I really thought that theater consisted of rich white people talking. So I really wanted to mess with that. And that's how I sort of got drawn into language. But in this moment, it was about representing this type of person that I hadn't seen before. And I couldn't explain it. And then I couldn't explain it for 20 years. Actually, it didn't go that long. Maybe 15 years I went, not really understanding it. Until I was in graduate school when my mentors called me on it and was like, what are you doing? Like, what's that about? You actually do need to explain it. Like, that's cool and everything when you're 20. But now that you're a grown-up, making theater, having to communicate with people, you actually need to find a way to weave that more tightly into the meaning of the play. And I was like, And so eventually, after some searching and some learning and some living, I actually finally met, for the first time, some trans folks. And I was way late in life for that. I was late to the party on that. And I was like, oh, wait a second. And at that time, when I was in college, I'm a trans guy, and I'm in college and I'm identifying as butch, and I was a lesbian, but I didn't like that word. Because it's sort of like, if you know anything about that stuff, it's like sort of the generation before me. like that was a word that meant something to them, but it didn't mean something to me, and I didn't know why yet. But I knew that this was a boy played by a girl. And so at first I thought that it was an expression of butch identity, where I didn't really know how to ask for that, and that's what I was saying. But later on I learned, oh, actually I'm asking for trans representation, or for gender nonconformity. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And it's a great example of how the subconscious can know more than the conscious, right? We can be a lot smarter than ourselves sometimes inside. That's not always on the surface, and it takes some time to pull that out. And that's what I'm sort of describing about the writing process, is that sometimes you need to give it space. Can you believe I allowed myself to not know for so long? And that someone actually did my play, preserving the fact that I didn't know, and we didn't know. We couldn't answer it. But there's a way in which we took care of baby Sylvan, 20 years old, like not knowing. So these people were kind enough and generous enough to be like, okay, we don't get it, but let's try it. Let's do it. Let's see what it says. Let's see what it means. Let's see how it feels. And that was a tremendous gift that they gave me. I'm going to talk about two other kinds of knowledge, and actually I've blown my whole time without even reading to you because I'm just enjoying chatting with you. But I'll talk about one other project. This is an artist who I was hired to do a piece. It doesn't happen very often because I'm living in the world of playwrights where someone produces my play. But this was, and I'm not usually hired to write something. This was actually someone that Vic knows very well. His name's Dan Hurlin, and he was doing a piece about a photographer called Mike Disfarmer. And Disfarmer is an outsider artist, meaning he's not somebody who went through, traditional training, didn't end up showing in professional galleries, or even being known, or even thinking of himself as a professional artist. But when a big cache of his old work was found after his death, it was kind of a bombshell in the art world, and people were like, this work is amazing, oh my God, he's a new artistic hero. And he was taking lots of photos of the townspeople of this small town in Arkansas where he grew up around and made his adult life. He was like the small town portrait photographer. And the weird thing was, he's got this amazing body of work, but everything we ever could find about him is that people thought he was scary. He was like Boo Radley of his town. Don't walk by his house, something could happen. Or people would go to his studio to get their picture made, as it was called, and he'd be real grouchy. And somehow, even within being this grouchy, scary photographer, he ended up making this incredible body of work. And so Dan really wanted to explore this idea of, who is this guy? Why don't we know anything about him? What happened? And also, what does it mean for small towns for someone to almost have disappeared without us ever knowing them? So he hired me, and his mission, the mission he charged me with, was to not write a play. How do you do that? And I was like, cool. But I actually did know, I think I had a good idea of how I was going to do that, because what we were saying is that it's really important that we not make up a lot of stuff. We're not trying to fill Disfarmer with some characteristics and make him walk about and be like, I think this, I think that. We were just not interested. What we were interested in actually was the mystery. And so the process of making the piece was both, how do you make a show about somebody you don't understand, whose motives are unclear, whose inner life we have no access to, other than these shards, these fragments, this little bits of evidence here and there. And so that was the process we had to go through. And so for me, when I'm writing something like that, it's all, earlier we were talking about the mysteries, things that you didn't understand when you were a kid. And for me, making that piece, the task was kind of trying to access actually different kinds of knowledge he might have. Even if he might not have self-knowledge, he might know about photography. He might know about tornadoes, because he's living in tornado country. And we know that one of his studios was destroyed by a tornado. And then there's a sort of post-traumatic stress that can happen when you're living in that kind of those weather systems, right? You never know when your whole life is going to be ripped up and destroyed. We also thought maybe he had some queerness to him, maybe, and that either way he was isolated and an outsider to the people around him. and also that he looked down upon them. So here's a guy, he's judgmental, he's grouchy, he's an artist, no one understands him, he doesn't understand them, but the work is amazing. So it was really an interesting puzzle, because in some ways you're building this puzzle without having the thing to look at. You don't even know what this puzzle is going to be when you're done with it. So, so these are the kinds of things that I get myself mixed up in professionally. And so in some ways, not knowing is super important, because that's the engine, right? It's the engine of discovery, it's the engine of inquiry, and in some ways you have to actually really respect your baby self, if we're talking about self-knowledge in some cases. Like, you have to respect that you don't know. Like, that's actually quite special, and that actually is a way to connect with other people, because there's a space. There's a space inside you for searching, for learning, for growing, for connecting. Like, there's room. And so I'll just end with a little bit of reading. Do we have we can do that a little bit? Okay. This is a text of a book that I wrote that is an art book, and it's, I didn't bring slides of it or anything, but it's pretty phantasmagorical. And the piece is called High Winds, and it's about a character named High Winds who has insomnia, and he goes on a road trip in his mind. And for me, this came out of moving to LA and being a real stranger to this landscape, and also to having insomnia and being like, what the hell? How do I live? So this guy, he starts to go on a search for his estranged half-brother. And I'll just give you a little taste of the language so you can get a sense of the kind of space that is necessary to kind of welcome someone into your question. High Winds, prologue. A tissue box apartment without a view of anything. Los Angeles. High Winds lays in bed covered in men's magazines. Bold-smelling bloom in the air. Awake at wrong hours again. Drifting off any minute now. Long nights like this. Weeks. Months. Insomnia, he learns, has many causes. Night becomes a sad, hallucinogenic roller coaster. Something is very lost. Maybe I don't need sleep. Maybe I don't need to be here. No, don't think like that. But when it gets real bad, it's real bad. I need a life. High Winds has a brother, Bantam. Well, half-brother, but who's counting? His only family now, who doesn't want to be found. Gave High Winds the world through the small rear window of his '89 Celica. Gave him his name from a weather report. Then took off one day, left his room behind, his mess and smell, and High Winds with an empty house. Even now, years later, High Winds still mystified. Tonight, the spark catches. Where is he? High Winds stops waiting for sleep at 5 a.m., gets mad at art, writes inside his books, climbs out window, scratches face on neighbor's fruit trees, borrows neighbor's old black truck without asking, turns up Fairfax into the hills, drives through vintage postcards to find his brother. Not a story of loss, but of redemption? Or just a road trip for souvenirs. Strange signs guide him, because he thinks he didn't do anything. Doesn't even know what he did. So that's the beginning of that piece, and it opens up a lot of the questions that are going to circulate through the show, and you get the sense that this lost brother is this empty space for him, and he's got layers and layers of mysteries to solve for himself. And he's driving through vintage postcards, whatever that means. But I had to go with that. Like, my brain gave me that. And I was like, okay, here we go. Vintage postcards, I don't know what that means. And it turns out that he's sort of driving through some kind of landscape of Americana, but of a sort of lost kind. The rules are not real laws of physics, but that's part of the fun of it, I think. Anyway, so those are the kinds of knowledge that I traffic in. Thank you.
I have a plan. How about, I just got it. How about we take 2 minutes to actually turn to somebody next to you, or ideally behind you or diagonally across from you, and just take a moment to talk to someone. Great if you don't know them, fine if you do, but talk to them a little bit about what stood out for you here, what kind of question you might want to ask, how you might put all this together. In many ways, Tyler gave us that giant map to start with. What do we do with that map? Or do we toss it for the moment and just sit with the resonances of these 3 extraordinary talks? So this is like, please make a lot of noise. And we'll come back to a conversation between these folks and with you as soon as we finish. Okay, well, hang on to that thought, all right? Just hang on to it. I want to just give Tyler and Shane and Sylvan a moment just to register with one another a little bit about what they were hearing from each other, and then very quickly reopen this back up to you all. I do want to just ask you, when we do that, to please keep your comments, your questions short, so that there's more room for more people. But first, let's just let these folks talk a little bit with one another.
Well, I was just saying to Sylvan that I should have said more about self-knowledge. I think that, or knowledge of other people, actually. I think that psychology will be the last serious, difficult area for science to conquer. There's not a lot of talk about the brain now, of course, but the brain is not quite the same as psychology. And what's known about psychology is mostly relatively, it's like geography. They're mapping functional areas of the brain, but it's providing so far relatively little insight into psychology itself. Perception is an area of psychology that has really taken off in the last 40 or 50 years. It's become a mature science. But most of psychology, so psychology of motivation, psychology of action, the psychology of belief, these are matters that we're in the earliest primitive stages of trying to understand that, except from common sense. And novelists and playwrights have a very refined sense of psychological nuances that can provide a kind of knowledge, even though it's not systematic in the way we want science to be. One other point about this, you made a point about learning about yourself by doing, or you learn yourself, you were writing the play and you realized what was behind the writing the play only long afterwards. That's common and somewhat to be expected. I want to just tell one anecdote about history of philosophy here. Kant, who's one of the 2 greatest philosophers with Aristotle, I think, was also an astronomer. He contributed to astronomy early in his career. He was one of the first human beings to have some inkling of how absolutely colossal the universe is. So that's background. He realized that most of the universe was invisible to us, even with telescopes. But he said this about human psychology. He said, the reach and area of the unconscious in the mind is roughly proportional to the number of stars that we can't see, to the total. So, and I think this is actually true. Much of our psychology is unconscious, not just subconscious in the sense that we don't get to it easily, but is roughly irretrievable to us. So much of what goes in our mind goes on fast and unconsciously. That's going to be something psychology is going to have to map. But we don't have much access to it, and our access comes from seeing what it produces. So we kind of go backwards from how we act or how other people act to rough guesses about what kind of unconscious motivations are driving us. That seems to me both an issue for philosophy, for psychology, and for art. I think it's one of the most fascinating areas in the world, human beings and their psychologies.
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up, you were talking about, I think there was two major things that I think really caught my ear. One was this idea of the like subconscious, knowing before the conscious. And then the other is like this idea of horizontal information transfer.
You mean like when the collaborators, like talking to collaborators, or?
Yeah, so I forget exactly what you were saying, but you were talking about like about the idea of like being able to share knowledge, between each other, right? Okay. And I think like as people, we kind of take that for granted, but like, can you imagine like what life would be like if everything you learned, you had to learn on your own, right? I mean, because there are species where, that is the case, right? I mean, horizontal if we think about like transferring information, like I can have an experience and share it with you, right? And now it's like, oh, like I went down, I went around the block and a random person just punched me in the face for no reason at all. And you're like, oh, that I won't go around that block then.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really important information to have. And and I think that, for our biologically speaking, that's one of, the most important aspects of like our evolution as a species, and then modern culture as we see it, like our current pursuit of knowledge is all based around the fact, like the basic fact that we can transfer information, horizontally, and not just, vertically by way of genes. And the other thing is like this idea of the subconscious versus the conscious. Like when we think about like higher thought, and the parts of the brain that are involved in what we consider, higher thought, these are in a lot of ways what we call synapomorphies, right? They're aspects of form and function that are specific to a particular branch on the tree of life, right? And obviously, the way that our brains work are unique in many, many ways, but those unconscious parts, right? Like I guess some people call it the reptilian brain, which I hate that phrase, but that's how people know it.
Reptiles get really insulted by that.
Yeah, and I was raised as a herpetologist, right? So anyway, a herpetologist is a person who studies reptiles and amphibians. But this unconscious brain is much older, right? Evolutionarily speaking, right? I mean, these are things. I mean, it's from like the dawn of the dinosaurs, like all the way back to the origin of vertebrates, right? There are the aspects of like our basal, our basal consciousness, right? That are much older and therefore much more refined, right? If you were walking through the woods and you heard something go moo, even if you've never seen a cow before, you'd be like, oh, well, I wonder what that was. But if you heard something roar, you'd probably run. All right? You got no idea what it was. You don't need to know what it was. It's like, whatever that is, I don't want any part of it. Why? Like, no, I'm sure very few people besides myself have actually been chased by an animal, of decent size that could actually eat you. But you'd still run, right? Because something in you, right? No, like your hair will stand on end, et cetera, et cetera. Why? You don't know why, but you're doing it, right? And it is probably for the best.
Yes. Run, Shane, run.
Anyway, all that's to say, it's really interesting to see how those ideas, sort of, play out within the realm of the arts.
Yeah.
Just one anecdote about the lower brain. This has its analog in psychology. A lot is known about how fast various things are seen. The the very fastest things that are seen as certain types of things are in the neighborhood of a 20th of a second, little more than a 20th of a second. The very fastest forms that are recognized in vision are forms of spiders and reptiles. So that played such an important part in evolution. I'm surprised about the spiders, actually. The reptiles I kind of get. But apparently there were enough spiders out there biting to develop our visual systems in such a way that spiders and reptiles together are the fastest things that we can recognize.
That part of my
visually.
brain must be broken because I have a tendency to go towards them instead of away from them.
Right.
Yeah.
It also produces fast reactions too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the action side of things.
Would you say that, like, I mean, this might be a sort of, entry level. I mean, it's totally entry level.
Bring it, man.
But I'm just like, are we, like, what is next for humans and our evolution, Like, I mean, just from my field, I wonder, actually, if it could be said that the ways in which activism happens pushes humans to evolve in some way. Like, what role, like, a question I have is, like, what role does, say, accepting other people who are different from you, like, how does that function evolutionarily? And, like, so for example, right, think about trans movement, right? We all know about trans and gender nonconforming stuff so much more than we would have even 5 years ago because activism has happened, right? And, I mean, there's so many other examples we could look at where activism has pushed people towards greater knowledge. But just from the trans thing, the fact that we can even say this stuff out loud, that I can talk about this with you, no one's chasing me right now. Roar! I know, for real. I mean, some people, that's their reality. But anyway.
Yeah, so this is hard from an evolutionary perspective, right? Because the process of evolution, is reactive, not predictive, right? So evolution isn't working towards anything.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's reacting to things. But I think, generally speaking, when we think about, our evolution as a species, I think one of the things that, that we're beginning to realize is that, I mean, there is a lot, generally speaking, across many, many axes, right? There's just there's a lot of variation, right? Amongst our species, right? That is, that can be amongst our species because of exactly what you were just saying. Like, nobody's going to chase. Well, some people might, but we're not going to go there. But in a modern society, in a quote unquote non-evolutionary sense, but like evolved cultural society, they're like group acceptance, right? So this is one thing. It's like, it's hard to think of evolution playing out at the population level, right? At the group level, right? Evolution is a process that we typically think about playing out at the individual level, right? And that there's all sorts of game theory about why evolution at the group level doesn't work. Like mostly it's like the problem of the cheater, right? Anytime you have an established system and somebody cheats, they're going to benefit, right? If they're going to benefit, they get more resources. They have, they're going to have more offspring. If those offspring cheat, then all of a sudden everything's broken, right? So this idea, so from an evolutionary sense, this idea of group selection, right? It's a hard one to reconcile. But one of the things that we're learning, is that we as a species, like we've also, we've found some very creative ways to fight the process of evolution, in different ways as it might, as it might play out. I mean, longevity, a lot of different things.
I'm just going to interrupt you a little bit right now because there are just so many people buzzing with so many thoughts, and there's just so much time. So we have mics, and they're going to be moving quickly, but if you would like to ask a question, I see you have a mic already, so we'll go right there, and from there, somebody, the next person around, person with red shirt in second row. So You know who you are, right? Okay. Right.
Okay. Thank you guys all for coming here tonight. It was great. My question specifically to Professor Burge. You were talking about psychology being like the final frontier for what we know about knowledge. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on how neuroscience can provide insight through fMRIs and EEGs. Like specifically speaking, like let's say we have a patient that has like PTSD. Couldn't you use these type of machines to understand like what region specifically is being affected by these kind of memories? So then we'll have like qualitative data or quantitative data that would explain, okay, this is how we can go about treating this certain psychological disorder or like this issue.
Sure, I think at very broad and crude levels of explanation, neuroscience can definitely cast light on psychology. So I was downplaying it only to contrast it with what we ideally want, that is a systematic psychology. Neuroscience hasn't given us anything remotely like that, but it can provide medical pointers as to how to treat psychological diseases. This mapping of areas of the brain that correspond very grossly to psychological functions can be a source of cure of psychological problems. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but it's one tool we can and should be using.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right over here, we're going to just try to keep our back and forth a little bit brief so that we can have more people engaged.
Okay. On those really cool cards outside, I wrote, knowledge is the next best thing to the truth. And it always seems to be tantalizingly out of reach, the truth, being able to actually know something. And as educators, how do you keep that desire and that excitement and the wonder in trying to get to that truth alive in your students? You just gave some great examples here, and I'd just like to hear how you do that in your day-to-day work as educators.
We have some really great speakers right here who are totally captivating and super excited about what they do. I really think it's as simple as being passionate about your material. And that kind of enthusiasm is contagious. For me, it's kind of that simple. And also, people who are self-selecting to be theater majors are, they're really into theater.
Yeah, for me, it's certainly not keeping the flame. It's keeping the flame from burning up the rest of my life. The interest of understanding this world better is just, totally central to my way of life. So,
That's so
no
beautiful.
problem keeping it going.
So beautiful. Other responses here? Students, I'm looking at you like it.
Hi there. Over here.
Where?
Here.
Okay.
Hi. So I also identify as not cisgender. So I'm also really interested in writing stories for representation. And I have a question about what goes through your mind when you're trying to communicate stories to people who don't understand, I guess.
I don't think about them so much. Because if I invited them into my brain, I might not ever write something. So in some ways, I just have to do me, I just have to do what I want to do and write for the people the audience I do know, and that if you just put yourself fully into what you're doing, the rest will follow. And if you work with the resources you have, the resources being the people as well that you have, you can't go wrong. I think trying to speak to people and I'm not trying to convert anybody or teach anybody about being trans or queer or anything like that. In fact, I'm really trying to show a world in which queer people just live in it. We're not obsessed with becoming, and that's an important storyline too, coming out. But I also think we have to just walk with, confidence whenever we can and just do it and let people also do their own homework.
Right back there. Is it on?
I was really impressed by the ability to bridge the two communities of knowledge, the sciences and the humanities. So it made me rekindle the concept of consilience. So I had a question for Dr. Burge about whether you think that there is a unifying theory of knowledge. Is there a unity of knowledge?
Well, that very abstract explication that I gave in the beginning, true justified belief for the justification tracks the truth, that's unified, but it's very, very abstract. I'm quite content with the plurality of types of knowledge. I think philosophy has spent too much time trying to reduce all types of knowledge to one type. So I'm much more fascinated by the differences among types of knowledge. But there is an abstract unity. They're all knowledge in a recognizable sense, but the differences in the ways the knowledge is acquired and knowledge is supported are what impress me as a philosopher. I'm more interested in exploring those differences.
Thank you. Another, somebody in the front row, if we have a mic.
And there's a student right there in the third row.
Okay, go for it, and then, well, from students to the front row. Yeah, you need, yeah.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. I think this might be like an office hours question. Maybe it's just like a fundamental misconception of like what a priori could mean. But I was just wondering if like self-knowledge is ever a priori, or if it's something that we like have to sense, or like we need some sort of empiricism to back. I don't know.
So is self-knowledge ever
Come
a priori?
first.
Is that right?
I think a little bit is. So a priori means supported, but not supported by sense experience. I think Descartes' cogito is a priori in that sense. His cogito says, I'm now hereby thinking. Right? I think you know that not by looking around the world or introspecting. You know it by understanding your own thought. It's got to be true, right? It makes itself true. And there are other types like that I think are a priori, but I think most self-knowledge is empirical. It depends on observing yourself or observing others and then applying it back to yourself and so on. Even within self-knowledge, there's wonderfully interesting varieties of types of support. And your question, I think, brings this out very well.
I think, there you go.
Hi, I hope it's on. So what I have to say, I do not think contradicts any of the panelists. But I want to make a bigger claim and perhaps a bit more, I don't know what to say, cohesive one for art, because to me one very important thing that art does, how it functions when we look at the history of art, and not necessarily only Western art, is that it is a means of inquiry. And I think that's been indirectly said, but I don't think when I look at what I know of art, and I'm not trying to make myself Mr. Expert, but it doesn't only ask, well, what is it to be human? What are emotions? What is this feeling? I think it can make very big philosophy-like, and does do this, I won't say can, but does make philosophy-like larger or deeper or whatever inquiries, such as what is reality? It does it in what it will do epistemological work or epistemological light work? What are the limits of how we can know reality? But it does it in an artistic way. What I want to say is that art is its own means of inquiry. It's independent of, say, science. It's independent of philosophy. It's, you know, I was a philosophy student. In fact, I was a student of Professor Burge's many years ago, which I'm rather proud of. But I think that art is not beholden to any of these fields. It does its own work. One last thing I want to pitch along this, I'm sorry to be a little sketchy, is that I'm not so sure art is pledged to yielding knowledge per se. It might be something a little different than knowledge. It might be, we're always arguing about art, right? There's no final answers to, a great work of art. We always argue over, is this some great work of art? Is art this such thing? There's a lot of, different paths I can go in. I don't want to take up too much time, but I simply want to introduce that art does a lot of stuff, and a lot of big stuff, and that's why it's so both treasured and fought over within cultures and within society. That's anybody. I'd especially like to know what Professor Burge has to say.
You know what? I'm so sorry, but we are running out of time. So, in fact, we're kind of at that moment. If you would like to make, what were you want to hear from the other student?
With a microphone.
All right. So, Eugenia, right? Geneva, close. All right. If you would like to ask our last question.
I just wanted to ask what the body's role in knowledge is. Yeah, I know it was touched upon, and there were other points made, but I just thought it would be fun to throw in there.
The question is, what is the body's role in knowledge? Here's what I propose. I'd like to give each of our guests this evening an opportunity to close out the evening, but perhaps you would like to say something about the body and knowledge in doing that. Is that too much of a...
It's like, we didn't provide a conclusion.
There we go. But it's going to be short because we got to send everybody home. All right, I think you're ready to go for it, Shane.
Yeah, so the body's role, as a biologist, right, when we think about like the body's role in knowledge, anytime we think about scientific pursuit, right, we are limited to the tools that we have, right, and as our tools become more sophisticated, so does our exploration of knowledge in a scientific sense, but at the end of the day, right, I mean, we as individuals, those explorers of knowledge, are limited to our own senses and to our ability to interpret those things that can't be sensed by one of our senses. So I think that, when we think about the pursuit of knowledge, functionally speaking, I mean, it's, the body is where that pursuit starts and also a lot of times where it ends.
Well, I know, that was pretty good. Where else does it end?
Well, I guess, the body plays a really big role in making theater, right? I mean, it's a collaborative art form. I don't perform the play most of the time. Other people do. So I actually have to translate. I have to find a way to get my feelings and my thoughts and ideas into the page so that when an actor picks it up, they can intuit between the lines the emotions that I was trying to convey to them. And then they have to memorize everything, figure out where they're going on the stage, and then they have to convey that to you. So there's just an incredible, actually, trans-body communication system where this whole thing has to flow. And that's part of what makes it, hard to do sometimes. And I guess I would also say that I also think that audiences play a really important role. Like your body is sitting in a room with these other bodies who are saying things to you that are making you feel things, right? There's a real communion happening in that space, which is why theater comes out of ritual. So I think that, theater's all over the body. The body's all over theater. You can't separate it. It has a lot of roles to play.
Bodies on bodies.
Yep.
Tyler, would you like to add something there?
These questions are so huge. Perception developed evolutionarily, I think, largely to protect the body, to enable it to navigate through the world safely. We have a sense called proprioception, which is a perception of the way the body is from the inside, so to speak. So, for example, right now, without having to look, if your eyes were closed, you'd still know whether you're upside down or not. There are sensors which feed back to you such information. So I think, again, the body is all over the basis of knowledge. On the art point, I certainly agree art is not beholden to any other discipline. I also agree that it's not fundamentally out to produce knowledge, though I think it does produce knowledge. And I also agree there's a kind of inquiry involved in art. I tend to think one of the important aspects of this inquiry is broadening our imagination by confronting us with new possibilities or new angles on the world. I think that is very attractive to most human beings, feeling expanded by being exposed to art. So I'm broadly sympathetic with most of what you said.
I have to just stick in a word as a choreographer.
Yes, please.
As a dancer person.
Yes.
We're going to have to dance?
Yeah, right. Actually, if you think of yourself as dancing when you leave this room, even if you're walking, you're dancing. Actually, I just wanted to say, why is it that we think there's something different between the body and the mind or thought? So, the Cartesian ideas that, that's your area, I know, but that we carry with us are ready to be challenged in the way that we even talk about this, because embodiment is knowledge, right? And thought and body are one and the same. I want to thank you all for your tremendous generosity and spirit tonight. And I want to thank you all for your tremendous generosity and spirit tonight. I hope you have a good evening.